Robert Sapolsky's Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. A book review by Luke Clyde. Narrated by Luke Clyde. Part 1. The book's goal. Sapolsky's twofold goal in his 2023 book Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will is as follows. Number 1, quote, "The first is to convince you that there is no free will, or at least that there is much less free will than generally assumed when it really matters," end quote. He claims that if you, quote, "put all the scientific results together from all the relevant scientific disciplines, then, quote, there's no room for free will," end quote. Asserting that scientists and other key thinkers who argue for free will are all mistaken, Sapolsky maintains that these people are doing one of the following. A, quote, "focusing solely on just one sliver of the biology of behavior," end quote. B, using, quote, "faulty logic, such as concluding that if it's not possible to ever tell what caused X, maybe nothing caused it," end quote. C, or demonstrating an, quote, "unawareness or misinterpretation of the science underlying behavior," end quote, such as, quote, "emotional reasons that reflect that there being no free will is pretty damn unsettling," end quote. As a part of this first goal, he seeks to, quote, "explain why I think all these folks are wrong and how life would improve if people stopped thinking like them," end quote. His methodology in arguing against free will is to survey studies within various scientific disciplines using the analogy of, quote, "turtles all the way down," end quote, to show that from the preceding second of a human decision to the seconds to minutes, to the hours to days, to the preceding months to decades before, to childhood and fetal environment, culture, ancestors, and evolution of our species, there's, quote, "an infinity of turtles all the way down," end quote. Quote, "turtles can't float in the air," end quote. All the scientific disciplines, including genetics, neurochemistry, and evolutionary biology, quote, "collectively negate free will because they are all interlinked, constituting the same ultimate body of knowledge," end quote, demonstrating that, quote, "there's not a single crack of daylight to shoehorn in free will," end quote. The, quote, "first half of the book's point is to rely on this biological framework in rejecting free will," end quote. A framework of an infinite regression of biological causes extending back through time. Number 2. The second is to, quote, "take seriously all the implications of there being no free will," end quote, both, quote, "individually and societally," end quote. The implications Sapolsky lists include the following. A, quote, "that there can be no such thing as blame and that punishment as retribution is indefensible. Sure, keep dangerous people from damaging others, but do so as straightforwardly and non-judgmentally as keeping a car with faulty brakes off the road," end quote. B, quote, "that it can be okay to praise someone or express gratitude toward them as an instrumental intervention to make it likely that they will repeat that behavior in the future or as an inspiration to others, but never because they deserve it, and that this applies to you when you've been smart or self-disciplined or kind," end quote. C, quote, "that you recognize that the experience of love is made of the same building blocks that constitute wildebeests or asteroids," end quote. D, quote, "that no one has earned or is entitled to being treated better or worse than anyone else, and that it makes as little sense to hate someone as to hate a tornado because it supposedly decided to level your house, or to love a lilac because it supposedly decided to make a wonderful fragrance," end quote. These implications can be summarized by stating that no one deserves or earns anything, either good or bad, because people aren't morally responsible for their actions. Therefore, any punishment should simply be to prevent people from damaging others. Any praise or gratitude should be only to encourage people to repeat, or inspire others to do, healthy or beneficial behaviors. First, Sapolsky makes it clear that he's attempting to ground his argument against free will, first half of the book, in scientific studies, and then he bases his argument for a change in social rewards and punishment systems, second half, on what he believes are simply implications of a world without free will. His argument in the second half is therefore closely tied to whether his conclusion in the first half of the book, i.e., that there is no free will, is true. As long as you're willing to put up with Sapolsky's stylistic choice to constantly employ sentence fragments for effect, sometimes to a painful degree, and his overt naturalist presuppositions, you will find Determined to be both an educational and engaging read. While it can, at times, leave readers wishing for certain issues to be dealt with in more depth, the book covers an impressive and diverse array of topics. Below is a survey of the topics this book covers, arranged in successive bullet points with page numbers. Part 2. The book's content. First half. Brief overview of philosophical positions on determinism, free will, and whether people have moral responsibility. See image below where I arranged the way he describes these positions into a visual chart form. Lebeshian experiments and the debates surrounding the timing of when a readiness potential occurs in a person's brain versus when that person perceives that they are making a conscious choice. The relationship between outside stimuli and a person's reactions to seemingly unrelated topics. Neuroplasticity and how specific hormones affect the brain's reactions and judgments, such as the effects of testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin, and glucocorticoids. The amygdala, visual cortex, auditory cortex, motor cortex, frontal cortex, and hippocampus, their relationship with one another, and trauma's effect on different brain regions. The Adverse Childhood Experience (ACE) score, and the effects of parenting, peer socialization, environmental influences, culture beliefs and values, climate, and other forms of stress and abuse on brain development. The fetal environment's effect on the brain. DNA, genes, gene regulation, and the neurotransmitters of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Culture, examples, individualist versus collectivist, rainforest versus desert dwellers, tight versus loose cultures, and their effect on the brain's perceptions of the world. The development of the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, PFC, the function of the dorsolateral PFC and the ventromedial PFC, and the effects of fatigue, stress, and hunger, trauma, and PTSD on decision-making. Chaos theory, or chaoticism. Reductionism, the three-body problem in physics. Rule 22, cellular automata, and how some chaotic patterns are simultaneously unpredictable yet still determined. Quote, a cell, a brain, a person, a society was more like the chaoticism of a cloud than the reductionism of a watch, end quote. Predictability versus determinism, and the concepts of convergence and overdetermination. Emergent complexity, examples, ants, bees, slime mold, and iterative bifurcation, examples, a Cantor set, Koch snowflake, and Menger sponge, trees, neurons, and rivers, with simple parts that eventually emerge into more complex systems. 3 problematic interpretations of emergent complexity, including number 1, chaotic missteps redux, number 2, orphans running wild, number 3, defying gravity. The quantum indeterminacy or random, quote, stochastic, end quote, movement of, quote, Brownian motion of particles, beta amyloid peptides bumping into each other, a fertilized egg splitting in two, and a sea predator doing a levee walk, end quote. Wave particle duality, discovered in 1801 by Thomas Young's double slit experiment, and an electron's simultaneous existence in 2 or more places, superposition, as a wave or random location as a particle when seen by a recording device or observed or measured, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Quote, those who are not shocked when they first come across quantum theory cannot possibly have understood it, end quote. Niels Bohr. Quantum entanglement and John Stuart Bell in the 1960s proving Einstein's mathematical interpretation of entanglement in 1935 wrong. The time non-locality of entanglement because of instantaneous interaction. The superposition of an electron's location being potentially, quote, on the other side of the wall, end quote, having, quote, tunneled through it, end quote, quantum tunneling, and therefore the fundamentally indeterministic nature of the subatomic universe. The efficiency of electrons in photosynthesis because of potential quantum superposition. The disparity between quantum mechanics regarding electrons and predictable classical physics on the macro level of biology. The incompatibility of the prospect of quantum randomness with free will. The filter on top of randomness regarding mutation and the immune system, but why the model can't work for human decision-making. And the flaws in the model of downward causality in which a person allegedly messes with his or her quantum randomness in the decision-making process. Second half, Discussion on why a society of people not believing in free will doesn't cause people to increasingly harm society, because it's the people apathetic about whether free will exists and about where moral decency comes from, not the strongly religious or strongly unreligious people, who are the most harmful to society. Explanation as to why a lack of free will and the ability for humans to change their behavior are not mutually exclusive, and, starting with the analogy of a sea slug, how a human's behavior can change based on how its amygdala is conditioned by outside influences to make certain associations. Discussion in Chapter 13 of examples of humans changing how they react and respond to certain behaviors based on updated information, including the examples of epilepsy, schizophrenia, autism, PTSD, dyslexia, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and the point that these examples show, quote, we can subtract responsibility out of our view of aspects of behavior, end quote. A discussion in Chapter 14 of historical examples of punishment, including the lepers plot involving mobs burning and sacrificing lepers and Jews in the 14th century France and Germany, the 16th century Dutch physician Johann Veer's reform to the witch justice system, the execution of Robert François Demieux in Paris in 1757 involving foot crushing, scorching, castration, cheering from the crowd, quartering, and burning at the stake. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission model of justice, following the apartheid in South Africa. A discussion of restorative justice versus the quarantine approaches to justice, such as Norway's open prison system. And the final public hanging in America in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1936. The Prisoner's Dilemma second-party punishment simulation game, the third-party punishment of police and how oxytocin increases a person's willingness in taking on this burden, the fourth-party punishment where the police are punished for improperly fighting injustice, and the fifth-party punishment for the police review board for not punishing corrupt officers. And the fact that some small traditional hunter-gatherers cultures don't have third-party punishment and just don't bother punishing cheaters. Society's fascination with serial killers, including Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Charles Manson, Son of Sam, Boston Strangler, the Zodiac Killer, the Night Stalker, the DC Sniper, and Jack the Ripper. A discussion of the unlikely serial killer Ted Bundy, the invention of the electric chair by a dentist, and Bundy's execution by electric chair. German psychologist Tanya Singer's study with 6-year-old kids and chimps regarding punishment. The discussion surrounding Timothy McVeigh's act of terrorism in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, and his eventual execution by lethal injection. An overview of the evolution of punishment as illustrated by the examples previously mentioned, and the response by the government and victims to punishment. The criminal case of Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik, how the Norwegian government responded to his acts of mass murder. Other examples of victims not desiring punishment, and final thoughts regarding the notion of where do we go from here as a society and how we should respond to criminal acts given what we know from science today. The psychological reasons why people want to believe in free will, and that the science in this book ultimately teaches that there is no meaning. There's no answer to why beyond this happened because of what came just before, which happened because of what came just before that. Discussion of how believing there's no free will can lead to a fundamental sense of pointlessness and a lack of a desire to live since there's no ultimate meaning or purpose, that a person would be reduced to a waking coma. A reminder of how this feeling a sense of pointlessness and lack of a desire to live after coming to believe there's no free will shows that you are privileged and one of the, quote, lucky few, end quote. A case study of people suffering from obesity and how knowledge about neurobiology affected them. And concluding examples of how people regularly blame others for biological realities those people have no control over, and a final admonition to remember that people don't deserve or earn anything because we're all just products of our biological processes and history, so people should treat everyone equally without hate and partiality. Part 3. Response Overview. Not only is Sapolsky's discussion of such a diverse array of topics indeterminate, informative, and engaging, but I also find myself agreeing with many of his points. He's a gifted communicator and good at making otherwise academic or boring topics accessible and interesting. Readers willing to seriously wrestle with the book's arguments will likely come away with a number of helpful takeaways that will further inform the way they think about many factors influencing human choices, whether the world is deterministic, whether free will exists, whether people should be morally responsible for their actions, how people should respond to neurodivergent behaviors, how people should respond to a person's bad decisions and actions that harm others, and how people should respond to a person's positive achievements and benevolent actions. Throughout the book, Sapolsky brings up many helpful points based on findings within the disciplines of neuroscience, neuroendocrinology, biological anthropology, psychology, and criminology that I sincerely believe could improve society, particularly the criminal justice system and disciplines involving behavioral treatment, if people seriously consider them. However, many of these helpful points are, in my opinion, overshadowed by faulty underlying presuppositions regarding metaphysics, epistemology, philosophical anthropology, and ethics. After reading through the book slowly and carefully, taking rigorous notes, and then going through the book a second time to make sure I didn't miss any key points, followed by listening to an interview with him about this book, I can honestly say that while there are many helpful insights presented throughout the book which made it an educational and worthwhile read, the conclusions of the book's arguments are ultimately based on faulty philosophical presuppositions and flawed reasoning. I'll start this review by discussing the most helpful aspects of the book, followed by addressing its assumptions and reasoning. Part 4. The book's strengths. Strength number 1. Introduction to how the brain works in relation to behavior. In Chapter 2, Sapolsky discusses 3 successive generations of Lebesgue experiments and the related debates surrounding the timing of when a readiness potential occurs in a person's brain compared with when that person perceives they are making a conscious choice. Following this discussion, in chapters 3 through 4, he proceeds to give an informative introduction to how the brain works in relation to behavior. Within these chapters, he covers a variety of neuroscientific topics, including the brain's reaction to outside stimuli, the dynamic of neuroplasticity, how various hormones, examples testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin, glucocorticoids, as well as fatigue, stress, hunger, and PTSD affect the brain's reactions and judgments, the function of different brain regions, examples frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, PFC, dorsolateral PFC, ventromedial PFC, amygdala, visual cortex, auditory cortex, motor cortex, hippocampus, and trauma's effect on certain regions, and the effects of parenting and home environment, reminding the reader of the Adverse Childhood Experience ACE score, peer socialization, culture, climate, stress, fetal environment, DNA, genes, and neurotransmitters, with examples like serotonin, dopamine, neuroepinephrine on brain development. Understanding the neuroscience of how the brain develops, functions, reacts, and makes judgments can enable people to become more empathetic to the challenges faced by others less fortunate than them, or provide hope to those less fortunate that change is possible, more comprehensively evaluate the motivations and causes behind harmful actions and criminal behavior, more effectively change behavior and habits, or recover from trauma and life-altering events, make more prudent judgments, examples how hunger affects judicial decisions, and function more wisely and efficiently in various contexts. As a neuroscientist with his PhD in neuroendocrinology, these topics are clearly his area of expertise and overlap with the content of his popular 2017 book, Behave. His explanation of them is quite informative and well written. Strength number 2. Primers on chaos theory, emergent complexity, and quantum indeterminacy. Another helpful aspect of the book is the explanation he gives regarding other relevant scientific topics such as chaos theory, example clouds, cellular automata, reductionism, example a watch, the three-body problem in physics, convergence and overdetermination, emergent complexity, example ants, bees, slime mold, iterative bifurcation, example Cantor set, Koch snowflake, Menger sponge, trees, neurons, rivers, and a discussion of some problematic interpretations of emergent complexity, quantum indeterminacy or random stochastic movement, example, Brownian motion of particles, beta amyloid peptides bumping into each other, a fertilized egg splitting in two, a sea predator doing a levee walk, wave particle duality, superposition, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, quantum entanglement, time non-locality of entanglement, quantum tunneling, examples of quantum mechanics in biology, examples electron superposition in photosynthesis, mutation, the immune system, and a discussion of some problematic interpretations of quantum mechanics. In all of these topics, he provides readers with sufficient rudimentary knowledge so that they can understand and follow his lines of argumentation as he addresses various interpretations of the scientific data, specifically as it relates to the debate regarding free will. I find his refutations of others' arguments that chaoticism, emergent complexity, and quantum indeterminacy are examples of free will to be logical and sound. And I especially appreciate his treatment of quantum mechanics, pointing out that while there is indeed indeterminacy on the subatomic level, example of electrons, there remains no definitive proof that the indeterminacy of the quantum universe actually, quote, bubbles up, end quote, to affect the macro level of biology and neurological processes in the human brain. Similarly, those who erroneously suggest that quantum mechanics provides a means of spirituality and can empower people to manifest what they imagine and affect quantum fields of interrelated oneness of the universe to raise vibrations and spiritually evolve the planet would do well to read about the basics of quantum mechanics from an actual scientist. Strength number 3. Historical overview of neurodivergent conditions and capital punishment. He begins the second half of the book attempting to refute the popular claims that a society of people not believing in free will result in its people becoming increasingly harmful in their behavior, and that b a lack of free will and the ability to change one's behavior are mutually exclusive. While I do find his conclusions in these chapters somewhat overstated, he brings up some valid points that should be considered by those who make such claims. Following these chapters, he dives into the heart of his content in the second half of the book, including a historical overview of how society has viewed and responded to certain neurodivergent conditions and of forms of capital punishment from the 14th century up until the present time. Both of these chapters are instructive in showing how popular opinion has significantly changed over time, for the better, based on scientific findings coupled with an increased desire to empathize and understand the factors leading to a person's behavior. The historical overview in Chapter 13 of Society's View and Response to Epilepsy describes an egregious and horrific story indeed, as he traces its trajectory across the expanse of the ages. With the exception of certain examples he uses that don't actually support his argument, example his incorrect reading into the Mark 9:14-29 pericope that the boy is allegedly experiencing symptoms of epilepsy rather than abuse by an unclean spirit as the text actually states, his discussion of the topic is helpful in pointing out the immense harm done when society incorrectly attributes a pathological condition like epilepsy to supernatural causes. Similarly, his case study on the evolution of society's view of schizophrenia shows the harmful consequences of placing blame on family members and childhood environment for a neurological condition. He then briefly mentions examples of harmful societal responses to other neurological conditions as well, including autism and PTSD. It's a very interesting and helpful chapter. In Chapter 14, he walks readers through another case study, this time on the historical evolution of capital punishment. From mobs hunting lepers and Jews down and burning them in the 14th century to the 18th century public quartering and burning of people like Robert de Mier, the final public hanging in the U.S. in 1936, the electric chair for people including serial killer Ted Bundy, and the death of lethal injection of people including terrorist Timothy McVeigh, to other modern alternatives to capital punishment, such as the post-apartheid reconciliation model in South Africa and the Norwegian 21-year punishment sentence of terrorist Anders Breivik to Norway's unique prison system, Sapolsky takes readers on a fascinating journey into a very emotionally charged topic. From this survey of forms of the death penalty and punishment to discussing serial killers and terrorists, a study with 6-year-old kids and chimps regarding punishment, various punishment models, and how the brain feels good when witnessing a criminal getting punished, it would be an understatement to say this was yet another interesting and educational chapter. I do also see his point in proposing the quarantine model of punishment instead of the capital punishment model for severe serial crimes, even though I find his case perhaps a little too simplistic and naive in some respects. Strength number 4. The universe is real and ordered, existing independently of our observance of it. Within a popular culture today seemingly obsessed with esoteric pseudoscientific notions of the alleged law of attraction, manifesting, oneness of all things through quantum fields, interspirituality, Eastern philosophy, experimentation with psychedelics, and mysticism, I appreciate how Sapolsky clarifies throughout the book in various ways, both explicitly and implicitly, that the universe is both real and ordered. It isn't an illusion. The reason why science can make intelligible observations and discover actual facts about how the brain, biology, the world, and the universe work is precisely because the universe and its ordered existence does, in fact, objectively exist independently of our perceptions and observations of it. Advances in scientific discovery depend on this being true. A person suffering from a severe infection still suffers from it regardless of whether that person has previously observed or even knows what an infection is and its cause. The reality of that infection is undeniable. It's not created by the person's mind. It's objectively harmful to the person as a biological reality. Humans function within the universe, having a real independent ontological existence in it. While having dominion, i.e., exerting control, over certain aspects, we don't create reality as some philosophical idealists and New Thought proponents would have us believe. Even the most perplexing discoveries of the subatomic universe, examples wave-particle duality, quantum superposition, quantum entanglement, quantum tunneling, while fundamentally strange, haven't disproven these things on the macro level of biology, as Sapolsky, I believe accurately, argues. Everything that exists has a cause and doesn't float uncaused as a turtle in midair, as he would say. So, while the various forms of life in the world aren't all ontologically one, as Eastern philosophy teaches, they are all necessarily caused by something. While existing independently of one another, humans and every other biological form of life on planet Earth are each part of a real causal relationship extending back through time and do have the potential of affecting one another's life and existence. Part 5. Summary of Strengths. Clearly, there is a wealth of knowledge in this book about neurological research, other areas of scientific study including chaos theory, emergent complexity, and quantum mechanics, and various well-informed psychological, historical, sociological, and criminological discussions. For the interested reader, this book serves as a fascinating entry point into a diverse array of topics, organized in a way that's engaging and easy to follow even for those without scientific credentials. From the educational value of scientific research to the noteworthy takeaways sprinkled throughout, such as the need of judges to eat before court trials, the need to examine the deeper backdrop of what may have led the person to pulling the trigger rather than merely the seconds before it, the need to empathize and seek to better understand the childhood environment of those less fortunate than us, and the need to not be quick to place blame on someone without seeking to understand the neurological factors behind the person's actions, such as schizophrenia or autism, the book is packed with helpful information. And Sapolsky's intuitive and expressly humanizing argument that it's imperative for society to intentionally separate forms of punishment from the excitement, or joy as he calls it, that so easily accompanies them is commendable. As he points out, the evolution of forms of punishment have demonstrated signs of improvement along the way, but there's certainly still much need for improvement. While not an exhaustive list of all the things I appreciate about Determined, these examples give you a sufficient glimpse into why I found it a fascinating book written by a learned scientist. Part 6. The book's weaknesses. Weakness number 1. No working definitions of determinism and free will. While Sapolsky references numerous studies allegedly in support of his arguments, I've ultimately decided not to assess any particular scientific study mentioned in this book in depth to decide whether it truly is relevant to his arguments. In the spirit of being charitable to him, and for the sake of time, I've simply decided to give him the benefit of the doubt in this sense. Instead, my points in this section will focus on what I will call meta-problems, which address either overarching problems with concepts or principles in the book, clear philosophical presuppositions or assumptions, or faulty reasoning in his main arguments. The first of these meta-problems I'll discuss is regarding definitions. On page 14, Sapolsky has a section titled Ground Rules and Definitions. One of the subsections under this is on pages 15 through 17, entitled, What Do I Mean by Determinism? In this subsection, he begins by discussing what the French polymath Pierre-Simon Laplace meant by the word determinism, followed by clarifying that science has since disagreed with aspects of how Laplace described it, example, quantum indeterminacy, and then mentions a couple other accommodations that must be made in one's understanding of determinism, such as meta-level consciousness, the fact that brains and behaviors can still change. Finally, he finishes off the section with an illustration of a university graduation ceremony, concluding with the assertion that if you were able to magically swap the life circumstances of a graduate there and an underprivileged person collecting the garbage at the event, and the experiences that led each to where they are now in life, you'd inevitably be swapping who was graduating and who was collecting garbage. Here are his last 3 sentences in this section. Quote, Let's go all the way so that in addition to the garbage collector having gotten all that of the graduate's past, the graduate would have gotten the garbage collector's past. Trade every factor over which they had no control, and you will switch who would be in the graduation robe and who would be hauling garbage cans. This is what I mean by determinism, end quote. While illustrations like this can be helpful to further clarify what someone means by a term or concept, in this case, the brief mention of Laplace, a couple further accommodations, and this illustration is all we get. How can an illustration further clarify a definition that doesn't exist in the first place? We can intuit what we feel determinism is based on this illustration, but there's no scientific way to assess whether his claim about these two people being swapped is actually true. Obviously, most of us, me included, would feel like he's more or less correct. If we swapped the past of these two, doing so would likely also swap who is graduating and who is collecting garbage. But the problem is there are far too many variables, and it's just an analogy, a thought experiment. It feels like he's providing a true assertion, but we have no way of testing whether it actually is. Moreover, he never once provides his own working definition of determinism throughout the book. If we were to line up 20 different people who, after reading this entire book carefully, were asked to state Sapolsky's specific definition of determinism, there would likely be key differences in how they each believed he defines it. Perhaps many of them would believe he simply defines it as a world without free will, but I'd venture to guess that answer wouldn't be sufficient to Sapolsky himself, lacking necessary details that would distinguish it from other people's definitions with whom he disagrees. This is precisely my point. For a scientist writing a book named Determined that's written to a popular audience who's probably not scientifically trained, without ever providing his own working definition of what determinism is within that book is, to be frank, unacceptable. As previously mentioned, I agree with him that the natural world is largely deterministic in the sense that it's well ordered with measurable and observable interrelated causal relationships extending back through time. But again, that's what I intuit. It seems his understanding of determinism is far more rigid, yet he provides no working definition. The same can be said of what he means by free will. On pages 14 through 15, he includes another subsection entitled, What do I mean by free will? In this subsection, he begins with, quote, People define free will differently, end quote. He continues with, quote, Here's my take, end quote, after which he defines what he means by free will. Oh wait, no, he doesn't. Instead, he spends the rest of the section providing and discussing, you guessed it, an illustration. This illustration is of a man shooting a gun. He talks about the mechanics of the muscles of the finger that pulled the trigger and then about a neuron's action potential because it, quote, was stimulated by the neuron just upstream, which had its own action potential because of the next neuron upstream, and so on, end quote. He then concludes the section with the below paragraph. Quote, here's the challenge to a freewheeler. Find me the neuron that started this process in this man's brain. The neuron that had an action potential for no reason, where no neuron spoke to it just before. Then show me that this neuron's actions were not influenced by whether this man was tired, hungry, stressed, or in pain at the time. That nothing about this neuron's function was altered by the sights, sounds, smells, and so on experienced by the man in the previous minutes, nor by the levels of any hormones marinating in his brain in the previous hours to days, nor whether he had experienced a life-changing event in recent months or years. And show me that this neuron's supposedly free-willed functioning wasn't affected by the man's genes or by the lifelong changes and regulation of those genes caused by experiences during his childhood, nor by levels of hormones he was exposed to as a fetus when that brain was being constructed, nor by the centuries of history and ecology that shaped the invention of the culture in which he was raised. Show me a neuron being a causeless cause in this total sense. The prominent compatibilist philosopher Alfred Mealy of Florida State University emphatically feels that requiring something like that of free will is setting the bar absurdly high. But this bar is neither absurd nor too high. Show me a neuron, or brain, whose generation of behavior is independent of the sum of its biological past, and for the purposes of this book, you've demonstrated free will. The point of the first half of this book is to establish that this can't be shown. End quote. Well, what do you think his definition of free will is, based on the above? Here's what I came up with. Free will is the existence of a neuron or brain that had an action potential for no reason, a causeless cause, whose behavior is independent of the sum of its biological past. As my attempt here does, we can each attempt to intuit or try to piece together what he defines free will as based on how he describes it throughout the book, but we won't be certain we're entirely accurate without him providing his own working definition. To write a book to, quote, convince you that there is no free will, end quote, requires precision by the author to define exactly what that term means and how he understands it, especially a loaded term like free will that can have a range of nuanced meanings. It's also ironic that this section is literally titled Ground Rules and Definitions, within which he provides no working definitions of his own, or at least doesn't clarify what specific definition he'll be using. John Horgan, director of the Center for Science Writings, asks Sapolsky this same question about what his working definition of free will is in an interview, and Sapolsky responds in a similar manner without providing a definition. His argument in the above also runs the risk of being a mere argument from ignorance ad ignorantiam. Instead of intending to provide evidence for his positive claim that free will doesn't exist, he subtly shifts the burden of proof here onto those who believe in free will by asserting that their claim is invalid simply because they can't scientifically prove his claim to be false. Furthermore, if they were to respond to this by pointing out what they believe to be an example of free will, he could just explain it away by appealing to some undiscovered neurological cause or a multiplicity of interrelated causes that would be impossible to empirically prove or disprove. You can see why this is bad argumentation. It's pretty much just one person's philosophical preconception against another person's philosophical preconception, thus ending in nothing more than an impasse. After a simple Google search of, quote, definition of free will, end quote, I noticed that the Cambridge Dictionary defines free will as, quote, the ability to decide what to do independently of any outside influence, end quote. Notice how this definition doesn't require a neuron to have, quote, an action potential for no reason, end quote, or to be, quote, a causeless cause, end quote, as Sapolsky suggests it requires. All it requires is for a person's conscious mind to make a decision using his or her brain, i.e. working with one's own biological tools, which doesn't require creating a neuron out of thin air. Sapolsky's analogy of what he calls turtleism, i.e., turtles all the way down, just doesn't fit the data. Sure, generally speaking, there are certainly numerous neurological, biological, and environmental factors beyond our control, as he clearly points out in chapters 2 through 4, extending back through time that bring any of us to the present moment. But the deeper you dig, the more you discover that many of the problems regarding the nature of human consciousness, a couple of which we will later discuss, for example, paint a much more multifaceted picture of the human psyche, suggesting that the concept of free will doesn't fit into his overly simplistic and rigidly linear physicalist or materialist understanding. Here's the irony. The reductionist approach he chides others for using in Chapter 5, when thinking about human biology, appears to be a similar approach that he's taking, from which he derives his simplistic understanding of free will. Weakness number 2. Scientific rigor in the first half versus personal intuition in the second half. Our next task is to address what I believe is a fundamental inconsistency between his reasoning in the first half compared with the second half of the book. When arguing against the existence of free will in the first half of the book, he does so with scientific rigor. In his own words, if you, quote, put all the scientific results together from all the relevant scientific disciplines, end quote, then, quote, there's no room for free will, end quote. His methodology is to ground whether free will exists in scientific empirical evidence. Whether one agrees or disagrees with his conclusions regarding free will, at least the scientific experiments and evidence he presents can be examined to see if his conclusions are convincingly accurate. However, one wonders how he arrives at certain moral conclusions in the second half of the book. He seems to assume that all of his moral assertions are simply, quote, implications of there being no free will, end quote. But how does one derive an ought or an ought not, i.e., what someone should or should not do in morality, from an is or an is not finding in science regarding how nature works? According to Sapolsky, quote, we are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment, end quote. Or in other words, quote, we are the end products of our material brains, end quote. We are merely our brains and nothing more. We don't have a brain, we are our brain in this view. To believe that there is a we that is distinct and separate from our mere physical brains, quote, sets our thinking back centuries, end quote, according to him. This philosophical position is known as physicalism, which we will touch more on later. So how does he arrive at certain emphatic conclusions about how we ought to treat certain people or even criminal behavior? I'm glad he's empathetic toward those who've made bad decisions in life, but his conclusions are merely his personal intuition or his moral convictions, causing him to think that way. He's reading his intuition of what feels right and wrong to him into his discussions of historical dealings with criminals, as well as the ways people have responded to medical conditions such as epilepsy and schizophrenia. Science can help us discover that both epilepsy and schizophrenia are neurological medical conditions, as he points out. It can also help us discover that the brain can feel immense pleasure out of watching someone get punished, as he points out. Science can help us discover the sort of brain a certain serial killer has, such as how that person's prefrontal cortex has been developed and how the amygdala has been conditioned by outside influences to make certain associations. We can even grant Sapolsky his contention that science can inform us we don't have any moral responsibility for our actions. That is, if our moral actions are merely based on the kind of conditioning our brain has undergone over which we had no control, because this would mean moral actions are merely derived from inevitable neurological processes. But while science can provide us with certain neurobiological explanations to show why a person may have treated others in a certain way, it can't tell us how we should or should not treat others. Those are moral claims. For a supernaturalist, example a Christian, morality is not merely derived from natural neurological processes, but from a rational source outside the natural world of physical processes, and therefore outside of the physical brain. A grounding outside of the brain and nature enables a person to have the capacity to make rightful judgments that can be considered objectively right or wrong, not just one person's inevitable brain conclusion versus another person's inevitable brain conclusion. Now we're entering the realm of ethics, seeking to understand the nature of morality. But for a naturalist like Sapolsky, what is objectively right or wrong about this or that form of punishment when moral judgments are simply brain synapses that were biologically inevitable, giving us no ability to choose anything other than the choices our brains chose right now, with a brain, quote, over which we had no control, end quote. I'm not suggesting we can't change our mind or make choices in this view, because he certainly believes we can. I'm merely pointing out that the grounding of our choices has no objectivity to it which can be consistently applied to others outside of ourselves according to this naturalist view. C.S. Lewis describes the dilemma in this way, quote, "Yet if the oughts of Mr. Wells and say Franco are both equally the impulses which nature has conditioned each to have, and both tell us nothing about any objective right or wrong, whence is all the fervor? Do they remember, while they are writing thus, that when they tell us we ought to make a better world, the words ought and better must, on their own showing, refer to an irrationally conditioned impulse which cannot be true or false any more than a vomit or a yawn?" End quote. He goes on to state the following, quote, "If we are to continue to make moral judgments, and whatever we say we shall in fact continue, then we must believe that the conscience of man is not a product of nature. It can be valid only if it is an offshoot of some absolute moral wisdom, a moral wisdom which exists absolutely on its own and is not a product of non-moral, non-rational nature." End quote. With Sapolsky's faulty ethical epistemology in mind, it's telling how he responds when asked what can be done to prevent young people from feeling hopeless and incapable of being effective positive change agents in the world. Quote, "We're the only species that can do the craziest, nuttiest thing out there, which is come up with a belief that says the less it seems possible to change something, the more you have to try to change it. The more unforgivable the act, the more you have to find the means to forgive it. The less lovable the person, the more you have to find the means to love them. And God help me, as an atheist, this is some school of Christian theology." And then he goes on to say, quote, "But we're the only species that can do that." End quote. Even other atheist authors, such as historian Tom Holland, would likely have a thing or two to say about these naively confident assertions that the truth or falsity of these moral directives can somehow be derived from naturalist biological processes. These moral directives are commendable, but the epistemology is dubious. I genuinely don't think Sapolsky, as a scientist and not a philosopher, realizes he's falling prey to this epistemological dilemma in his approach to ethics. And I very much commend his insistence for those with challenging mental and medical conditions, as well as criminals, respectively, to be treated properly in accordance with current scientific, medical, and criminological research. It's just that he has unfortunately embedded within his own thesis of this book, specifically the second part that represents the second half of the book, the faulty assumption that his moral convictions, his personal intuition regarding what needs to be changed in how we treat people, are really just natural, quote, implications of there being no free will, end quote. Even though I myself and other readers might share some or many of these same moral convictions, they're just that, internal moral convictions. Those who wouldn't share these convictions would likely point out his lack of scientific empirical grounding, thus being left unconvinced. Weakness number 3. Avoiding problems regarding human consciousness. In Chapter 2, Sapolsky repeatedly harps on one of the primary findings from all the Libetian experiments, which is that the subject in many of these studies perceived he or she had made a particular conscious choice seconds after there was already a specific kind of neuroactivity observed in his or her brain, called a readiness potential. Many incompatibilists, those who don't believe in free will, like him, point to this as evidence in support of their claim that humans don't have free will. Following his discussion of these experiments and their findings, he briefly addresses some of the counter-arguments many compatibilists, those who believe in free will, provide. Here are the 5 categories of their counter-arguments. Number 1. The point that the level of sophistication of the choices presented in these experiments was very low and thus not very relevant to real-life scenarios. Number 2. The fact that the predictability of these experiments was between 60 to 80% at best. Number 3. The point that the readiness potential doesn't necessarily equal the decision. Number 4. Points made regarding the complexity of what consciousness is and how that relates to the brain's neurological activity and the decision making process and perceptions. And fifth and finally, the point that there is still the potential to have the power to veto an urge before acting upon it, or what he calls, quote, free won't, end quote. Within his responses to these arguments, his response to arguments regarding the nature of consciousness is particularly noteworthy. In the first paragraph of his section entitled What is Consciousness, he mentions the following, quote, giving this section this ridiculous heading reflects how unenthused I am about having to write this next stretch. I don't understand what consciousness is, can't define it. I can't understand philosophers writing about it, or neuroscientists for that matter, unless it's consciousness in the boring neurological sense, like not experiencing consciousness because you're in a coma, end quote. He then spends the rest of this short 3-page section on consciousness discussing what I believe, and so does he, are fairly irrelevant and inconsequential arguments and debates. The problem is, that's it. He spends a total of 3 pages in his entire book, a book some consider one of the best books out there arguing against free will, responding to issues relating to the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the brain and free will. This is especially problematic considering the fact that he never even responds to what some consider one of the biggest problems within the study of human consciousness, and thus one of the biggest problems for the incompatibilist who assumes we essentially are our brain and nothing more. Before we discuss this problem, it's worth noting that what we'll be discussing potentially calls into question 3 related philosophical positions, all of which Sapolsky seems to hold. Number 1. Hard incompatibilism, the belief that free will doesn't exist. Number 2. Naturalism, the belief that the natural universe, and therefore the natural world, is all that exists in reality. Number 3. Physicalism, the belief that all of reality consists of physical processes, the laws of physics, and therefore the physical universe, commonly understood as the main alternative to dualism in positions of philosophical anthropology. Regarding incompatibilism, when we discuss the 4th major weakness of this book, we'll take a closer look at how his incompatibilist presuppositions prevent him from recognizing holes in his entire argument in the first half of the book. Regarding naturalism, in our previous section we discussed how Sapolsky's presuppositions appear to have caused him to incorrectly assume certain personal moral convictions were simply natural implications flowing from scientific empirical evidence. We also mentioned how he seems to have read these naturalist presuppositions into the Mark 9:14-29 passage, causing him to misinterpret the boy as suffering from epilepsy rather than abuse by an unclean spirit as the text actually states, since his naturalist beliefs prevent him from considering whether unclean spirits exist. Regarding physicalism, we find his physicalist assumptions bleeding through the pages as well. In his section entitled Free Won't, the Power to Veto, he emphatically rejects a 2-stage model where in stage 1, quote, your brain spontaneously chooses, amid alternative possibilities, to generate the proclivity towards some action, end quote, and then in stage 2, quote, you consciously consider this proclivity and either greenlight it or free won't it, end quote. He concludes this section with the following remarks, quote, as one proponent writes, freedom arises from the creative and indeterministic generation of alternative possibilities which present themselves to the will for evaluation and selection. Or, in Mealy's words, even if urges to press are determined by unconscious brain activity, it may be up to the participants whether they act on those urges or not. Thus, our brains generate a suggestion and we then judge it. This dualism sets our thinking back centuries, end quote. Did you catch that last phrase? He confidently asserts, quote, this dualism sets our thinking back centuries, end quote, as if the mere fact that dualism isn't as popular today as it was centuries ago somehow invalidates it. But this isn't necessarily the case. This is a mere argument from popularity, ad populum. The truth or falsity of a philosophical position isn't determined by either its age or its popularity level in any particular time and place. It stands or falls on its own claims. Dualism, for the purposes of this discussion, and likely what he means here, is the belief that there is a human mind or consciousness based on what some would refer to as the human soul, that is a distinct aspect of the human person providing the ability to make a decision beyond the deterministic processes of the physical brain. This anthropological position may not be as popular as it was centuries ago, but that has no necessary bearing on whether it's true. What about another belief, such as heliocentrism? This was believed by some in the ancient world, but wasn't popularized until many centuries later. Did its age or level of popularity within any particular culture at any given point in time determine whether it's a true view of reality? Nope. If its popularity waned today, perhaps due to some unimaginably egregious errors in scientific experiments, it would still be just as true. Neither does the age or popularity of dualism determine whether it's true. This is probably an appropriate moment to point out another problem with his argument, a false dichotomy. Throughout this book, he presents an overly simplistic either-or approach to explaining human actions, as if human actions are explained either by a free will choice of a rational human mind beyond the brain, or by a specific deterministic activity in the physical brain. And since his physicalist position presupposes there's no such thing as a human mind beyond the physical brain, the deterministic activity one can observe and study in the physical brain must therefore be the only type of cause of that person's action. But the fact that there's neurological activity, or a series of biological activities or events, one can observe and study in the brain either just before a person's action or leading up to it in the preceding seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, or years, doesn't necessarily mean that this observable physical activity was the ultimate cause of that person's action. If there's an immaterial mind beyond the physical brain, it stands to reason that an observable neurological event doesn't preclude an immaterial free will choice behind it. A conscious free will choice doesn't require the choice to be an anti-biological choice, i.e. a magic floating turtle, as he perceives it does. Having a cause that isn't exclusively neurologically derived doesn't require it to be somehow ethereally detached from the physical universe. All it requires is for a person to make a decision from a rational immaterial source that is consequently executed by way of the confines of neurobiological processes. The existence of neurological processes preceding and during choices and rational free will driven choices aren't mutually exclusive. Hormones, the PFC, and a low ACE score are certainly influential factors with varying degrees of influence. But an influence isn't the same as a deterministic cause. The mere fact that the studies Sapolsky discusses have a sizable number of exceptions demonstrates that people aren't strictly bound by their physical brain's proclivities. They can have powerful neurological impulses causing them to feel like making a choice, but feeling like making a choice isn't the same thing as making the choice. If by studying someone's damaged PFC, a scientist can then determine a person's going to do a particular thing, but then that person ends up choosing to do another thing instead, it isn't an unreasonable idea to consider the possibility that the person's mind isn't equal to their brain's deterministic processes. Over the last few decades, physicalism and its presupposition that human consciousness is merely a derivative of the brain and its physical or material processes has become widely popular, especially in Western academia. It has become embraced in many circles almost as a scientific given at this point, such that if either a science or philosophy professor, a scientist, or a scholar in the academic world is discovered to hold or even teach a dualist position regarding anthropology as a potentially valid position, that person may run the risk of losing credibility in the eyes of his or her academic community. Every culture in history has had particular blind spots, and I think this is certainly one of them in our modern Western world. That said, as a Christian who believes in the existence of a human immaterial soul that the mind or consciousness is related to as a distinctly different aspect of a person from the physical brain and therefore body and its physical processes, the concept of dualism has always seemed to me grossly oversimplified. It seems to imply, based on what I've read in its literature, that the body and soul are two distinct aspects of the human person that are entirely separate from one another. This doesn't strike me as either a biblically sound position or a position that agrees with modern neuroscientific research. It would be more accurate to say that while the body and soul are two distinct aspects of the human person, they are still deeply and complexly related to one another and greatly affect each other, rather than being entirely detached and separate. We are equally spiritual and physical beings. A human is neither a body without a soul nor a soul without a body. The two go together, encompassing the whole human person. When immense physical harm is done to a person's brain, it has the potential to affect how their mind or soul perceives the world and reality, perhaps superficially analogous to how an old CD with scratches on it causes the CD player to have trouble playing the music as that music really sounds. This is one reason why physical, verbal, emotional, and sexual abuse can be so harmful to a person's perception of reality. It's both physically and spiritually harmful. However, if a person's soul and therefore conscious mind has come to the realization that there's hope and eternal life in Jesus beyond the grave no matter what has been or could be done to their physical body or brain, examples if they get tortured and killed, get into an accident and suffer severe brain damage, or develop dementia and Alzheimer's, they know that the blood of Jesus covers them, that God's grace through Jesus' death and resurrection in paying the penalty for their sin is sufficient, and that this current body is temporary, and they will get a new, resurrected, glorified body after death. The wasting away of our earthly bodies is not the end of our story. See 2 Corinthians 4:16. The deep abiding peace and joy that comes from this truth, this deep love and reverence of the Lord, can profoundly affect how a person navigates through this earthly embodied existence. I've personally seen the profound effect this has on some elderly people who have lost significant mental capacity to understand and respond to much of anything, yet are somehow noticeably uplifted when they hear a particular hymn or passage of Scripture or simply the name of Jesus. Our temporary bodies here on earth point to our eventual resurrected body that is promised to those who are in Christ Jesus. The Gospel account of Matthew records Jesus saying, quote, "And do not fear those who kill the body, zoma, but cannot kill the soul, psihi. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell," end quote. Matthew 10:28. In Proverbs, we are reminded that, quote, "The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death," end quote. Proverbs 14:27. Even though for those of us in Christ it would be better to be with the Lord without our earthly body than at home in our earthly body but away from the Lord, see 2 Corinthians 5:6-10, we were made as human beings with both a body and soul and ultimately await and long for the final resurrection of our bodies, our heavenly glorified bodies that we are promised in Christ. See Philippians 3:21, 1 Thessalonians 4:13, 1 Corinthians 15:21-22. Furthermore, what Jesus and the full counsel of his word, the biblical text, teach regarding philosophical anthropology, i.e., that a human person is comprised of both a body and a soul, are entirely compatible with modern neuroscientific findings. With this brief discussion of incompatibilism, naturalism, and physicalism versus dualism out of the way, we're now ready to discuss a couple of the unsolved problems regarding human consciousness and its relationship to the brain. First, let's discuss what I'll refer to simply as the binding problem. This is considered one of the easy problems regarding consciousness. To illustrate what this problem is about, imagine yourself in this simple setting. You're out for a walk. It's a beautiful, warm spring Saturday. You have no responsibilities or obligations this weekend and are just enjoying taking in all the beautiful sights and smells of springtime. While taking a relaxing walk, you notice a gorgeous big red rose, so you walk over to it, stop, and smell it. Ah, smells amazing, you think to yourself. As you come back to your house, you sit down with a good book and your favorite refreshing cold beverage. Feeling a gentle breeze, the inviting warmth of the sun, and hearing the birds chirping, you realize that this just couldn't be a more perfect day. The question is this: for someone in this setting, how did your brain integrate the various visual aspects of that big red rose into a single unified perception? You knew its shape, you knew it was red, you knew it was a rose. Perhaps you even saw a bee buzzing around near it while you went over to smell it. To this day, neuroscientists still have yet to figure out how the brain simultaneously integrates the vast array of components in our visual sensory perception into a unified whole. While neuroscience can explain how each part of the brain works in providing us with each of these individual visual components within our perception, there remains no explanation as to how they are all so seamlessly and simultaneously combined into a single integrated experience. What part or parts of the brain accomplish this visual perceptual binding? How does it work? Why is there such a disparity in the fact that the entire brain has basically already been mapped out in terms of understanding how each part functions, yet there's no clue as to how this fundamental visual perceptual experience is produced as a whole, even something as simple as the sight of a gorgeous big red rose? This is the binding problem. The binding problem leads us to an even bigger problem that I'll refer to simply as the subjective experience problem, which is considered one of the hard problems in the study of consciousness. Refer back to our above illustration. Think of the feeling of the warmth of the sun beating down on you, the sight of the beams of light shooting through the cracks between the branches of a large tree nearby, the sensation of a gentle breeze, the particular shade of red and the experience of the redness of the rose, perhaps the texture of a honeybee that you saw as you bent down to smell the rose, the smell of the rose and how it took you back to another time, another place, the sight of the brilliance of a cherry blossom tree as you walked past it, the depth and levels of the trees on the hill beside your neighborhood and their many cheerful shades of green, the smell of the neighbor's barbecue cookout. Perhaps you ate a piece of fresh fruit, and that first bite instantly woke up your salivary glands. And think of the interesting shadows of the branches cast along the texture and multiplicity of shades of colors across your lawn. The subjective experience problem is that none of a person's experiences, such as in this illustrative setting, examples experiencing the redness of the rose, the texture and sound of the bee, the taste of the fruit, the feeling of the warmth of the sun, the gentle breeze rustling through the tree leaves, the feelings of nostalgia or of being refreshed, the sense of longing, can be sufficiently explained through neuroauditory, visual, and motor processes. Individual components of this color or that shape or this sound might have explanations from neural processes, but not the subjective inner experience of each of those things, let alone their integrative experience together. The experience, quality, depth, sensations, perceptions, and integration of all these qualities simply can't be accounted for or understood in terms of physical processes or in all the best studies on how the brain works. This includes the thoughts, perceptions, and basic awareness of your perceptions and reflections in any given moment as well. These are deeply subjective aspects of human consciousness and experience. Add on top of all this the fact that no two people's subjective experience of any one of these things is entirely identical. The great chasm between the neuroscientific explanations and the interpersonal experience of consciousness is as vast as the Grand Canyon. In 1998, philosopher David Chalmers and neuroscientist Christoph Koch placed a 25-year bet. The bet was on this very topic of whether neuroscience would be able to explain consciousness, i.e. whether neural correlates of consciousness would be found, by 2023. Koch bet it would. Chalmers bet it wouldn't. Chalmers won the bet. Here we are, well into the 21st century, and after considering all the rapid advances of neuroscientific studies, science still has no clue on some of the easier questions of the nature of consciousness, not to mention the harder questions. With these two example problems in mind, we see just how confounded modern neuroscience remains when trying to figure out how the brain relates to human perception, subjective experience, and ultimately human consciousness and the mind. From the overly simplistic anthropological presuppositions of physicalism, seemingly the dominant position in academia today, to the overstated claims of incompatibilism, we see what appears to be examples of both of these in Sapolsky's lack of discussing prominent problems of consciousness such as the binding problem and the subjective experience problem. These examples demonstrate that science can know how all the parts of the brain work, but still remain clueless about how fundamental processes of daily life work in the human mind. And since so little is known about the relationship between human consciousness and the brain, then neither can neuroscience definitively conclude that the human soul and free will don't exist. While these problems regarding consciousness aren't direct arguments for free will, they naturally call into question many of the overconfident assumptions of incompatibilism, naturalism, and physicalism. I'm truly shocked he didn't once mention these problems that are at the forefront of neuroscientific studies today, even if he isn't personally involved or interested in them. Not including them is irresponsible and greatly betrays his naive philosophical assumptions. Weakness number 4. It simply doesn't follow. Finally, let's address the fourth notable weakness of this book, whether Sapolsky's ultimate goal of the first half to convince the reader that there's no free will is indeed accomplished. Is his argument valid, sound, compelling? I'll start by clarifying right away that I largely agree with many of his points and conclusions in chapters 5 through 10, in which he explains why no aspects of chaos theory, emergent complexity, or quantum indeterminacy themselves allow for the existence of free will. While I don't agree with everything he says in those chapters, as mentioned earlier, I agree with his main points that free will isn't likely to be found in arguments focusing on any of these three unique areas of science. With those 6 chapters out of the way, this narrows our scope to chapters 1 through 4, primarily chapter 3, which together constitute the material he uses to support his main argument, why he believes there's no such thing as free will. Let's take a closer look at his argument and conclusions. Sapolsky's goal. Quote, "The first is to convince you that there is no free will, or at least that there is much less free will than generally assumed when it really matters." End quote. While he doesn't provide his own working definition of free will, we deduced that he describes free will as something like this. Free will is the existence of a neuron or brain that had an action potential for no reason, a causeless cause, whose behavior is independent of the sum of its biological past. Sapolsky's claim, quote, "There is no free will," end quote. It's, quote, "turtles all the way down," end quote. From the preceding second of a human decision to the seconds to minutes, to the hours to days, to the preceding months to decades before, to childhood and fetal environment, culture, ancestors, and evolution of our species, there's, quote, "an infinity of turtles all the way down," end quote. Scientists and other thinkers who argue for free will are all mistaken in one of the following ways. A. They focus, quote, "solely on just one sliver of the biology of behavior," end quote. B. They use, quote, "faulty logic, such as concluding that if it's not possible to ever tell what caused X, maybe nothing caused it," end quote. C. They demonstrate an, quote, "unawareness or misinterpretation of the science underlying behavior," end quote, such as, quote, "emotional reasons that reflect that there being no free will is pretty damn unsettling," end quote. Sapolsky's argument. If you, quote, "put all the scientific results together from all the relevant scientific disciplines," end quote, then, quote, "there's no room for free will," end quote. Quote, "Something deeper than the idea that if you examine enough different disciplines, one ology after another, you're bound to eventually find one that provides a slam dunk falsifying free will all by itself," end quote. Quote, "It is also deeper than the idea that even though each discipline has a whole that precludes it from falsifying free will, at least one of the other disciplines compensates for it," end quote. Quote, "Crucially, all these disciplines collectively negate free will because they are all interlinked, constituting the same ultimate body of knowledge. If you talk about the effects of neurotransmitters on behavior, you are also implicitly talking about the genes that specify the construction of those chemical messengers, and the evolution of those genes. The fields of neurochemistry, genetics, and evolutionary biology can't be separated. If you examine how events in fetal life influence adult behavior, you are also automatically considering things like lifelong changes in patterns of hormone secretion or in gene regulation. If you discuss the effects of mothering style on a kid's eventual adult behavior, by definition, you are also automatically discussing the nature of the culture that the mother passes on through her actions. There's not a single crack of daylight to shoehorn in free will. As such, the first half of the book's point is to rely on this biological framework in rejecting free will," end quote. A framework of an infinite regression of biological causes, turtleism, extending back through time. Quote, As a central point of this book, those are all variables that you had little or no control over. You cannot decide all the sensory stimuli in your environment, your hormone levels this morning, whether something traumatic happened to you in the past, the socioeconomic status of your parents, your fetal environment, your genes, whether your ancestors were farmers or herders. Let me state this most broadly, probably at this point too broadly for most readers. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. End quote. Proposed support for Sapolsky's argument. From Chapter 2. As previously mentioned, Sapolsky discusses all the Libetian studies, pointing out the main conclusion that the subject in many of these studies perceived they had made the conscious choice seconds after there was already a specific kind of neuroactivity observed in his or her brain referred to as a readiness potential. Then he briefly concludes their findings. Quote, collectively, what does this Libetian literature, starting with Libet, show? That we can have an illusory sense of agency, where our sense of freely, consciously choosing to act can be disconnected from reality. We can be manipulated as to when we first feel a sense of conscious control. Most of all, this sense of agency comes after the brain has already committed to an action. Free will is a myth. End quote. Then he presents the counter-arguments by those who believe in free will, such as the following. Number 1, sophistication level. The point that the level of sophistication of the choices presented in these experiments was very low and thus not very relevant to real-life scenarios. Number 2, predictability level. The fact that the predictability of these experiments was between 60 to 80% at best. After responding to the counter-argument regarding predictability level, Sapolsky concedes that, quote, while certainly better than chance, this sure doesn't constitute a nail in free will's coffin, end quote. Number 3, the point that the readiness potential doesn't equal the decision. Number 4, what is consciousness? Points made regarding the complexity of what consciousness is and how that relates to the brain's neurological activity and the decision-making process and perceptions. And 5th and finally, the power to veto. The point that there is still the potential to have the power to veto an urge before acting upon it, or what he calls, quote, free won't, end quote. We already mentioned that he quickly rejects the two-stage model proposed with an appeal to tradition by nonchalantly stating, quote, this dualism sets our thinking back centuries, end quote, and then goes on to say that, quote, neither free will nor free won't neurons exist, end quote. He concludes the discussion of the studies by stating, quote, given the criticisms that have been raised, I think all that can be concluded is that in some fairly artificial circumstances, certain measures of brain functions are moderately predictive of a subsequent behavior. Free will, I believe, survives Libetianism, and yet I think that is irrelevant, end quote. From Chapter 3, quote, this chapter shows how you don't ultimately control the intent you form. You wish to do something, intend to do it, and then successfully do so. But no matter how fervent, even desperate you are, you can't successfully wish for a different intent. And you can't meta your way out. You can't successfully wish for the tools, say more self-discipline, that will make you better at successfully wishing what you wish for. None of us can, end quote. Quote, understanding this turtleism shows how the intent you form, the person you are, is the result of all the interactions between biology and environment that came before, all things out of your control. Each prior influence flows without a break from the effects of the influences before. As such, there's no point in the sequence where you can insert a freedom of will that will be in that biological world, but not of it, end quote. Quote, thus, we'll now see how who we are is the outcome of the prior seconds, minutes, decades, geological periods before, over which we had no control, end quote. In this Chapter 3, he goes on to discuss the following topics. First, the relationship between outside stimuli and a person's reactions to seemingly unrelated topics. Concluding this section, he states, quote, in other words, as we sit here deciding which button to push with supposedly freely chosen intent, we are being influenced by our sensory environment. A foul smell, a beautiful face, the feel of vomit goulash, a gurgling stomach, a racing heart. Does this disprove free will? Nah, the effects are typically mild and only occur in the average subject, with plenty of individuals who are exceptions. This is just the first step in understanding where intentions come from, end quote. Second, neuroplasticity and how specific hormones affect the brain's reactions and judgments, such as the effects of testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin, and glucocorticoids. Concluding this section, he states, quote, "Do these endocrine effects over the course of minutes to hours disprove free will? Certainly not on their own, because they typically alter the likelihood of certain behaviors rather than cause them. On to our next turtle, heading all the way down," end quote. 3. The amygdala, visual cortex, auditory cortex, motor cortex, frontal cortex, and hippocampus, their relationship with one another, and trauma's effects on different brain regions. Concluding this section, he states, quote, "The implications of all these findings are obvious. How will your brain function as you contemplate the two buttons? It depends, in part, on events during previous weeks to years. Have you been barely managing to pay the rent each month? Experiencing the emotional swell of finding love or of parenting? Suffering from deadening depression? Working successfully at a stimulating job? Rebuilding yourself after combat trauma or sexual assault? Having had a dramatic change in diet? All will change your brain and behavior beyond your control, often beyond your awareness. Moreover, there will be a meta level of differences outside your control in that your genes and childhood will have regulated how easily your brain changes in response to particular adult experiences. There is plasticity as to how much and what kind of neuroplasticity each person's brain can manage. Does neuroplasticity show that free will is a myth? Not by itself. Next turtle, end quote. 4. The Adverse Childhood Experience (ACE) score and the effects of parenting, peer socialization, environmental influences, cultural beliefs and values, climate, and other forms of stress and abuse on brain development. Concluding this section, he states, quote, "Does the role of childhood invalidate free will? Nope. The likes of ACE scores are about adult potential and vulnerability, not inevitable destiny, and there are plenty of people whose adulthoods are radically different from what you'd expect given their childhoods. This is just another piece of the sequence of influences," end quote. 5. The fetal environment's effect on the brain, DNA, genes, gene regulation, and the neurotransmitters of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. Concluding this section, he states, quote, "Does behavior genetics disprove free will? Not on its own. As a familiar theme, genes are about potentials and vulnerabilities, not inevitabilities, and the effects of most of these genes on behavior are relatively mild. Nonetheless, all these effects on behavior arise from genes you didn't choose interacting with a childhood you didn't choose," end quote. 6. Culture, examples individualist versus collectivist, rainforest versus desert dwellers, tight versus loose cultures, and their effects on the brain's perceptions of the world. Concluding this section, he states, quote, "Does the influence of culture disprove free will? Obviously not. As usual, these are tendencies amid lots of individual variation. Just consider Gandhi, Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Michael Collins, atypically inclined toward peacemaking, assassinated by co-religionists, atypically inclined toward extremism and violence," end quote. Chapter 3 concluding paragraphs, quote, "In order to prove there's free will, you have to show that some behavior just happened out of thin air in the sense of considering all these biological precursors. It may be possible to sidestep that with some subtle philosophical arguments, but you can't with anything known to science," end quote. Quote, "As noted in the first chapter, the prominent compatibilist philosopher Alfred Mealy judged this requirement of free will as setting the bar, quote, absurdly high," end quote. It is anything but an absurdly high bar or straw man to say that free will can exist only if neurons' actions are completely uninfluenced by all the uncontrollable factors that came before. It's the only requirement there can be, because all that came before, with its varying flavors of uncontrollable luck, is what came to constitute you. This is how you became you," end quote. Now moving on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with the development of the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, PFC, the function of the dorsolateral PFC and the ventromedial PFC, the effects of fatigue, stress, and hunger, trauma, and PTSD on decision making. Below are some of Sapolsky's main points and conclusions in this chapter. In this chapter, he includes a 2-column chart, with the column on the left titled Biological Stuff and the column on the right titled Do You Have Grit? Under biological stuff, he includes things that most people would agree are characteristics we don't have control over. These things include having destructive sexual urges, being a natural marathoner, not being all that bright, having a proclivity toward alcoholism, and having a beautiful face. And under the Do You Have Grit column are corresponding things that most people believe we do have control over. These corresponding questions include: do you resist acting upon them? Do you fight through the pain? Do you triumph by studying extra hard? Do you order ginger ale instead? Do you resist concluding that you're entitled to people being nice to you because of it? Commenting on this chart, he states, quote, "As one of the most important points of this book, we have as little control over the right side of the chart as over the left. Both sides are equally the outcome of uncontrollable biology interacting with uncontrollable environment." End quote. Quote, "Doing the right thing requires 2 different skills from the PFC. There's sending the decisive do this signal along the path from the PFC to the frontal cortex, to the supplementary motor area, the SMA of chapter 2, to the motor cortex. But even more important, there is the and don't do that even if it's the usual signal. Even more than sending excitatory signals to the motor cortex, the PFC is about inhibiting habitual brain circuits. To hark back again to chapter 2, the PFC is central to showing that we lack both free will and the conscious veto power of free won't." End quote. Quote, "In other words, there's co-evolution of gene frequencies, cultural values, child development practices, reinforcing each other over the generations, shaping what your PFC is going to be like." End quote. Quote, "We're pretty good at recognizing that we have no control over the attributes that life has gifted or cursed us with, but what we do with those attributes at right or wrong crossroads powerfully, toxically invites us to conclude, with the strongest of intuitions, that we are seeing free will in action. But the reality is that whether you display admirable gumption, squander opportunity in a murk of self-indulgence, majestically stare down temptation, or belly flop into it, these are all the outcome of the functioning of the PFC and the brain regions it connects to. And that PFC functioning is the outcome of the second before, minutes before, millennia before. The same punchline as in the previous chapter concerning the entire brain. And invoking the same critical word, seamless. As we've seen, talk about the evolution of the PFC, and you're also talking about the genes that evolved, the proteins they code for in the brain, and how childhood altered the regulation of those genes and proteins. A seamless arc of influences bringing your PFC to this moment without a crevice for free will to lodge in." End quote. Quote, "The takeaway from chapters 2 and 3 is that it's impossible to successfully wish what you're going to wish for. This chapter's punchline is that it's impossible to successfully will yourself to have more willpower, and that it isn't a great idea to run the world on the belief that people can and should." End quote. Finally, moving on to a couple points of his from the interlude of the book. Quote, "Why did that behavior, dastardly, noble, or ambiguously in between, just occur? Because of what happened a second before, and a minute before, and ellipsis in original. The easy takeaway from the first half of the book is that the biological determinants of our behavior stretch widely over space and time, responding to events in front of you this instant, but also to events on the other sides of the planet, or that shaped your ancestors centuries back. And those influences are deep and subterranean, and our ignorance of the shaping forces beneath the surface leads us to fill in the vacuum with stories of agency. Just to restate that irritatingly familiar by now notion, we are nothing more or less than the sum of that which we could not control, our biology, our environments, their interactions." The most important message was that these are not all separate ology fields producing behavior. They all merge into one. Evolution produces genes marked by the epigenetics of early environment, which produce proteins that, facilitated by hormones in a particular context, work in the brain to produce you. A seamless continuum, leaving no cracks between the disciplines into which to slip some free will." End quote. Quote, I recognize that I'm on the fringe here, fellow traveling with only a handful of scholars such as Greg Caruso, Sam Harris, Dirk Perrybloom, and Galen Strawson. I'll settle for merely significantly challenging someone's free will faith, sufficiently so that they will reframe their thinking about both our everyday lives and our most consequential moments." End quote. My response to Sapolsky's argument. After slowly working our way through these key points and conclusions based on the material covered in each of these 4 chapters, we're ready to take a step back and assess the evidence he presents in support of his argument and reasoning itself, and his conclusions. Regarding the evidence, as already mentioned, there's a wealth of knowledge in these chapters regarding findings of neuroscientific research and how it relates to the brain's development and human behavior. If Sapolsky's stated goal in this half of the book was something like, quote, "to convince you of the profound effects of all these different neurological and biological factors, many of which are outside a person's control, have on a person's ability to make thoughtful and wise choices in life," end quote, he would have certainly accomplished his goal. Many of the points he brings up about how the brain works and how it's deeply affected by DNA, genes, hormones, fetal environment, childhood upbringing, socialization, trauma, hunger, stress, and culture are immensely important and can greatly inform many areas of personal and public life. Life is complicated, and we need to show compassion to others and recognize that many have had way less fortunate lives than us and have much less capacity to make prudent choices in life because of many of these contributing neurobiological factors. We need to seek creative ways to help such individuals out of their amygdala-driven irrationality rather than two-dimensionally blaming them without seeking to understand how they arrived at the choices they made. And as I mentioned before, there's certainly much that needs to be improved in our criminal justice system, so his suggestions are instructive in encouraging positive change within that arena. When stating his goal, quote, "to convince you that there is no free will," end quote, he continues with, quote, "or at least that there is much less free will than generally assumed when it really matters," end quote. He later shares in a similar way that he would, quote, "settle for merely significantly challenging someone's free will faith, sufficiently so that they will reframe their thinking about both our everyday lives and our most consequential moments," end quote. This is a good and fairly reasonable goal. The problem is while these 2 quotes indicate that in theory he's satisfied with merely challenging people to rethink how much free will they have, based on factors that profoundly affect their decision-making abilities beyond their control, a reasonable goal, the actual argument of the entire book, from the title, Determined, a Science of Life Without Free Will, to the conclusions within each chapter, is that there's no such thing as free will, period. From cover to cover, he argues that, quote, "it's turtles all the way down," end quote, because if you, quote, "put all the scientific results together from all the relevant scientific disciplines," end quote, then, quote, "there's no room for free will," end quote. Again, here are 6 different articulations of this argument. Quote, "You cannot decide all the sensory stimuli in your environment, your hormone levels this morning, whether something traumatic happened to you in the past, the socioeconomic status of your parents, your fetal environment, your genes, whether your ancestors were farmers or herders. Let me state this most broadly, probably at this point too broadly for most readers. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. You're going to be able to recite this sentence in your irritated sleep by the time we're done," end quote. Quote, "Understanding this turtleism shows how the intent you form, the person you are, is the result of all the interactions between biology and environment that came before, all things out of your control. Each prior influence flows without a break from the effects of the influences before. As such, there's no point in the sequence where you can insert a freedom of will that will be in that biological world but not of it," end quote. Quote, "In order to prove there's free will, you have to show that some behavior just happened out of thin air in the sense of considering all these biological precursors. It may be possible to sidestep that with some subtle philosophical arguments, but you can't with anything known to science. All that came before, with its varying flavors of uncontrollable luck, is what came to constitute you. This is how you became you," end quote. Quote, We're really good at recognizing that we have no control over the attributes that life has gifted or cursed us with. But what we do with those attributes at right or wrong crossroads powerfully, toxically invites us to conclude with the strongest intuitions that we are seeing free will in action. But the reality is that whether you display admirable gumption, squander opportunity in a murk of self indulgence, majestically stare down temptation, or belly flop into it, these are all the outcomes of the functioning of the PFC and the brain regions it connects to. And that PFC functioning is the outcome of the second before, minutes before, millennia before. The same punchline as in the previous chapter concerning the entire brain, and invoking the same critical word, seamless. As we've seen, talk about the evolution of the PFC, and you're also talking about the genes that evolved, the proteins they code for in the brain, and how childhood altered the regulation of those genes and proteins. A seamless arc of influences bringing your PFC to this moment, without a crevice for free will to lodge in, end quote. Quote, the takeaway from chapters 2 and 3 is that it's impossible to successfully wish what you're going to wish for. This chapter's punchline is that it's impossible to successfully will yourself to have more willpower, and that it isn't a great idea to run the world on the belief that people can and should, end quote. Quote, the easy takeaway from the first half of the book is that the biological determinants of our behavior stretch widely over space and time, responding to events in front of you this instant, but also to events on the other sides of the planet or that shaped your ancestors centuries back. And those influences are deep and subterranean, and our ignorance of the shaping forces beneath the surface leads us to fill in the vacuum with stories of agency. Just to restate that irritatingly familiar by now notion, we are nothing more or less than the sum of that which we could not control, our biology, our environments, their interactions. The most important message was that these are not all separate ology fields producing behavior. They all merge into one. Evolution produces genes marked by the epigenetics of early environment, which produce proteins that, facilitated by hormones in a particular context, work in the brain to produce you. A seamless continuum, leaving no cracks between the disciplines into which to slip some free will, end quote. In other words, quote, there's not a single crack of daylight to shoehorn in free will. As such, the first half of the book's point is to rely on this biological framework in rejecting free will, end quote. He also clarifies what his argument isn't with the following key points. Quote, something deeper than the idea that if you examine enough different disciplines, one ology after another, you're bound to eventually find one that provides a slam dunk, falsifying free will all by itself, end quote. Quote, it is also deeper than the idea that even though each discipline has a whole that precludes it from falsifying free will, at least one of the other disciplines compensates for it, end quote. So, his argument isn't that any single discipline, such as epigenetics or neuroendocrinology, disproves the existence of free will. Nor is it that each of the disciplines fill in holes for each other so that free will can be disproven. Instead, quote, all these disciplines collectively negate free will because they are all interlinked, constituting the same ultimate body of knowledge, end quote. With this main argument in mind, below are his conclusions from each section as he walks his readers through each turtle allegedly in support of his arguments. His concluding thoughts on Libetian studies from chapter 2. Quote, but given the criticisms that have been raised, I think all that can be concluded is that in some fairly artificial circumstances, certain measures of brain functions are moderately predictive of a subsequent behavior. Free will, I believe, survives Libetianism, and yet I think that is irrelevant, end quote. His concluding thoughts on the brain's reactions to outside stimuli from chapter 3. Quote, does this disprove free will? Nah. The effects are typically mild and only occur in the average subject, with plenty of individuals who are exceptions. This is just the first step in understanding where intentions come from, end quote. His concluding thoughts on endocrinology from chapter 3. Quote, do these endocrine effects over the course of minutes to hours disprove free will? Certainly not on their own, because they typically alter the likelihood of certain behaviors rather than cause them. On to our next turtle, heading all the way down, end quote. His concluding thoughts on neuroplasticity from chapter 3. Quote, does neuroplasticity show that free will is a myth? Not by itself. Next turtle, end quote. His concluding thoughts on the discussion of the ACE and childhood development from Chapter 3. Quote, does the role of childhood invalidate free will? Nope. The likes of ACE scores are about adult potential and vulnerability, not inevitable destiny, and there are plenty of people whose adulthoods are radically different from what you'd expect, given their childhoods. This is just another piece of the sequence of influences, end quote. His concluding thoughts on fetal environment, DNA, epigenetics, and neurotransmitters from Chapter 3. Quote, does behavior genetics disprove free will? Not on its own. As a familiar theme, genes are about potentials and vulnerabilities, not inevitabilities, and the effects of most of these genes on behavior are relatively mild. Nonetheless, all these effects on behavior arise from genes you didn't choose, interacting with a childhood you didn't choose. End quote. His concluding thoughts on social environment, culture, and climate from Chapter 3. Quote, does the influence of culture disprove free will? Obviously not. As usual, these are tendencies amid lots of individual variation. Just consider Gandhi, Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Michael Collins, atypically inclined toward peacemaking, assassinated by co-religionists atypically inclined toward extremism and violence, end quote. So, in his own words, free will survives libationism, but he considers this ultimately irrelevant, following it up with a variation of the does this disprove free will? Nah, on to the next turtle conclusion for each successive turtle until, voila, no free will. What we have here is a line of reasoning in which each supporting piece of evidence is patently insufficient in supporting the argument until all of them somehow fit together into, quote, a seamless continuum leaving no cracks between the disciplines into which to slip some free will, end quote. He just keeps kicking the proverbial can down the path in each section and chapter until arriving nowhere except to insert his own magical conclusion, a floating meta-turtle. Obviously, all these disciplines are interrelated to one another, i.e. outside stimuli is related to endocrinology, which is related to neuroplasticity, childhood development, DNA, epigenetics, fetal environment, neurotransmitters, social environment, culture, and climate. But for him to then assert that there's zero room anywhere for free will is to essentially claim he's personally seen and therefore knows everything. He's claiming omniscience. I don't think any intelligent human being thinking through the implications of these studies would disagree with the notion that all these disciplines are highly complex and interrelated. We don't live in a vacuum. The brain you and I each have today is what it is due to millions of past factors leading up to the present moment. Life is complex, and from hormones to childhood and social factors profoundly affecting PFC development to trauma, so much in life happens to us and to our brains outside our control. Recognizing this truth can help any reasonable person to have increased empathy and compassion for others' life situations and addictions. As a brief side note, his argumentation even comes dangerously close to employing a sort of proof by intimidation or argumentum verbosum fallacy, because he just keeps throwing pieces of evidence and successive disciplines at readers, as if the sheer number of interrelated disciplines in neuroscience that he piles onto the argument will somehow convince them by making it seem impossible to imagine how one could refute such an overwhelmingly complex, interrelated, and large amount of neurological factors, which in the end serves to distract readers from the lack of cogency to the actual argument itself. Also, as previously mentioned, I agree that the natural world is largely deterministic. In other words, if the world didn't follow natural laws and wasn't well ordered with measurable and observable interrelated causal relationships extending back through time, we couldn't even do science or have necessary order and structure in life. But it simply doesn't follow from all these studies and scientific findings that there's no free will. And his conclusions in Chapter 4 certainly don't help his case either, saying that, quote, the takeaway from Chapters 2 and 3 is that it's impossible to successfully wish what you're going to wish for, end quote, and that Chapter 4's, quote, punchline is that it's impossible to successfully will yourself to have more willpower, end quote, is just another profound-sounding but ultimately incoherent self-referential loop in the end. No matter how carefully you read his specific argumentation throughout each chapter and do your best to parse the supporting material he presents, the science alone simply can't reasonably get you to the fringe philosophical position of concluding there's no free will. It may be the position many of the cool kids in academia are believing now, but it simply doesn't follow from the hard evidence. But there is something that can get you to this conclusion: good old-fashioned confirmation bias, in which you interpret evidence as if it confirmed your pre-existing beliefs. Not only does Sapolsky recognize that he's, quote, on the fringe here, fellow traveling with only a handful of scholars, end quote, in his belief that there's no free will, and going against a concept, i.e. free will, that's backed by, quote, the strongest of intuitions, end quote, but he himself wasn't reasoned into his position through assessing scientific evidence that he claims disproves free will. On page 9, he transparently clarifies the following, quote, as noted, I haven't believed in free will since adolescence, and it's been a moral imperative for me to view humans without judgment or the belief that anyone deserves anything special, to live without a capacity for hatred or entitlement, end quote. He reiterates this point when interviewed about this book. Quote, well, I kind of decided there was no free will at all when I was 14 in the middle of one rather tumultuous night, so I've been kind of thinking this way forever, end quote. We find other disconcerting examples of how he reads his incompatibilist assumptions into his arguments as well, sprinkled throughout the book. One such example is when he presents the below two-column chart in Chapter 4, with a biological stuff column on the left that includes things generally recognized as outside a person's control, and a do you have grit column on the right that includes questions recognized by most as evidence of free will. In his response to this table, he states the following, quote, as one of the most important points of this book, we have as little control over the right side of the chart as over the left. Both sides are equally the outcome of uncontrollable biology interacting with uncontrollable environment, end quote. He then proceeds to explain in the rest of the chapter how the frontal cortex works and how it develops. Even after carefully reading and considering all the details about the frontal cortex throughout that chapter twice, I can honestly say it simply doesn't follow that this knowledge of how the frontal cortex works and develops renders the items on the right side of the above chart as he claims it does. Of course, we can all agree that someone with a damaged PFC or even a rough childhood is more severely influenced by these internal and external factors in their decision-making processes than someone with a perfectly normal functioning brain or a healthy childhood filled with love. But I don't think I need to further explain how disturbing and demonstrably false it is to actually claim that, for example, having destructive sexual urges and acting upon those destructive urges are equally uncontrollable. This is just one example of other ways in which his confirmation bias bleeds through the pages at the expense of even basic common sense and intuition, all the while making claims out of his own moral intuition about how we should and shouldn't punish people for criminal activity. This double standard in his approach to ethics is quite an impressive game of mental gymnastics. His epistemology is inconsistent, and he honestly doesn't appear to recognize it. While the neurological and scientific insights he shares throughout the book within each of the different disciplines are indeed informative and beneficial, his philosophical conclusion that these somehow lead to there being no free will simply doesn't follow from those insights. The finger he points at others who approach the human in oversimplified and reductionist ways ultimately points back at himself in his implicit claim to omniscience when confidently asserting that together all these disciplines create a seamless continuum, leaving no cracks or crevices for free will. His faulty epistemology, likely resulting from his confirmation bias extending all the way back to adolescence, renders him incapable of recognizing his lack of sound reasoning due to his notable philosophical presuppositions. His conclusion simply doesn't follow from his purported evidence. Part 7. Summary of Weaknesses. From the lack of actual working definitions of determinism and free will, to the inconsistency in reasoning between the first and second halves of the book, the complete avoidance of discussing prominent problems regarding human consciousness, and the faulty epistemology of his main argument, likely resulting from a notably strong confirmation bias, it's difficult to overlook these four significant weaknesses of determined. While they aren't by any means a comprehensive list, they serve to demonstrate some of the book's most obvious meta-problems. From start to finish, the book is chock full of fascinating neurobiological insights from a range of scientific disciplines that simply don't lead to the philosophical conclusions he alleges. Part 8. Concluding Thoughts. As mentioned in various ways throughout this review, Determined is an interesting book. It serves as an informative primer on a broad range of disciplines, including but not limited to neuroendocrinology, epigenetics, quantum mechanics, psychology, sociology, and criminology in their relation to the human brain's function and development. For readers willing to seriously engage with the material Sapolsky presents, there are many key points made throughout the book that will force them to wrestle with ideas that challenge the status quo in many ways they may not have otherwise considered. However, Sapolsky's underlying faulty epistemology bleeds through the pages in a plethora of ways, including his strong confirmation bias, patently naive metaphysical and ethical presuppositions, and flawed arguments. Sapolsky is a brilliant scientist, not a philosopher, and this book is a prime example of what happens when a scientist tries to use scientific findings to persuade his readers to embrace a philosophical position beyond the scope of science that the author has already believed since childhood and which simply doesn't logically follow from the purported evidence presented. While many helpful suggestions regarding personal and public life are presented and determined, his primary goal of convincing readers that science disproves free will is severely undermined by his lack of sound reasoning. Incompatibilism, as well as the commonly related metaphysical positions of naturalism and physicalism, are, in my assessment, highly reductionist and greatly oversimplify the complexity of the human mind in forced and finally unconvincing ways, and we can unfortunately find all of these epistemological faux pas in the book with little effort. Science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of free will, as free will is a philosophical concept outside the scope of hard scientific studies. Determined is an intriguing thought experiment in its absolutist claims regarding free will, but its argument ultimately has no bearing on whether free will exists, and therefore does nothing to disprove the notion that we are morally responsible for our actions, since the claim in the book's second half stands or falls on whether the claim in the first half is true. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out the written form of this review below, which includes footnotes and a bibliography.